That life is present in plant life scarcely anyone is disposed to question, though there seems to be a desire to deny consciousness and intelligent activity, in the case on the part of the orthodox scientist. But the more advanced of the workers in the ranks of modern science do not hesitate to positively assert the presence of conscious, intelligent activity in plant life, and vigorously support their contention by logical argument backed up by incontrovertible facts gleaned in their laboratory experiments. These scientists hold that the presence of the phenomena of nutrition, reproduction, and of physical and chemical change due to adaptation is proof positive of the presence of vital intelligence within the organism in which the former are manifested. Professor Beiser says, adaptation, after all, is the best evidence of the presence of intelligence or life in forms or units of matter. Adaptation, also called physiological adaptation, but best called psychological adaptation, is the one weapon by which living organisms fight against the destructive forces of conditions of nature. In all its forms, adaptation is the more or less successful cooperation of living organisms with the laws of nature. It is not the disregard of natural laws. In taking adaptation as our criteria by which the presence of intelligence is determined, we find no difficulty in settling the question of the presence of life. The most perfect automatic machinery has no life because it cannot adapt itself in the least to the changing environmental conditions, and thus save itself from annihilation when necessity arises by the performance of simple intelligent acts. In their consideration of the question of the presence of consciousness in the kingdom of plant life, the writers divide the manifestation of intelligence into the three classes, namely, troposis, are acts pertaining to nutrition; neurosis, are acts pertaining to the nervous system; and psychosis, are acts pertaining to thought processes. The manifestation of troposis, or acts pertaining to nutrition, is apparent even in the case of the lowest forms of plant life. Even the lowliest vegetable cell takes nourishment and replaces the waste products of its system by fresh material taken into its system. These activities require a very simple nervous system, often practically no nervous system at all. But nevertheless, in every act of nutrition, there is manifested not only the presence of life, but also conscious activity of a certain degree. Even the lowest forms of plants are able to distinguish perfectly between nutritive and non-nutritive particles of matter. Most plants possess no nervous system, at least none yet discovered by science, but nevertheless they manifest characteristic troposis, corresponding in degree with their necessities, but seldom exceeding those necessities. Other plants, however, have a comparatively higher developed nervous system, or something corresponding to it, and manifest neurosis, or acts pertaining to the nervous system of a comparatively high degree. This is true of the sensitive plants and certain other plants of a high development in this direction. Some of the orchids and a few other plants manifest neurosis, indicating clearly the presence of consciousness and a degree of intelligent activity. Still higher in the scale, we find certain species of plants manifesting true psychosis, or acts pertaining to thought process, although the latter are of a comparatively low order as compared to those manifested by the higher forms of animal life. With this class of manifestation, the average student is not so well informed, and therefore it has been thought well to direct your attention in the following pages to these fascinating phenomena of plant life. We think that a careful consideration of the facts now about to be presented to the student will bring to him a clear realization of the presence of actual conscious activity in the kingdom of the plants, and will cause him to accept the statement of that eminent authority, Professor Beiser, who has said, "While we believe that the intelligence of man, animals, and plants is essentially the same in kind, we know that it differs enormously in degree and form. Even among men, this degree of intelligence varies, but this is because some individuals, by nature, see but a little more clearly their needs than others, and live under more favorable circumstances. That is all." Dr. J.E. Taylor, an authority on the subject of plant psychology, says, "Perhaps one reason why plants are usually denied consciousness and intelligence is because of the structure of even the highest developed species we find no specialized nervous tract along which sensations may travel, or where they can be registered, as in the case of the ganglia and brains of the higher animals. But it should be remembered that none of the creatures subkingdom of the protozoa, the lowest of the grand divisions of the animal kingdom, possess nervous systems, whilst many of the next more highly organized animal subkingdom, the Coleotenterata, have no trace, and the rest but a feeble development. Yet we do not deny these lowly organized animals a dim and diffused consciousness, or even the possibility of their structures being so modified that they can profit by experience, and thus develop that accumulated experience of their kind that we call instinct. Darwin, speaking of the wonderful sensitiveness of the root tip of plants, says, "It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radicle thus endowed, and having the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts, acts like the brain of one of the lower animals." I guess he's talking about the tip end of a root. "The brain being seated within the anterior end of the body, receiving impressions from the sense organs and directing the general movements." Professor Cope says we can understand how by parasitism or other means of getting a livelihood without exertion, the adoption of new and skillful movements would become unnecessary, and consciousness itself would be seldom aroused. Continued response would be followed by subconsciousness and later by unconsciousness. Such appears to be the history of the entire vegetable kingdom. Dr. J.C. Arthur, in his interesting work entitled "The Sagacity and the Morality of Plants," says, "I have tried to show that all organisms, even to the very simplest, whether plant or animal, from the very nature of life and the struggle for its maintenance, must be endowed with conscious feeling, pleasure and pain being its simplest expression. I have been told in Java, as one walks through a tangle of sensitive plants, they will drop down in their deprecating way for yards on either side, as if suddenly aroused into life, only to again transform into lifeless sticks by some unseen power. The physical basis of life, protoplasm, is the same for plants as for animals. The first differentiated or modified form of this we meet as is the curious animalcule called amoeba. As we watch its movements, we cannot refrain from ascribing to it some dim consciousness of the life it leads. But amoeboid structure is common even to the lowest kinds of plants, and amoeboid movements can be seen in some of its tissues. Witness also the habits and intelligent movement of the zoospores of seaweed and many other algae, and the locomotion of the antherozoa of mosses, ferns, etc. Not many years ago, these objects were classed as animals, and nobody doubted these so-called animals behaved consciously and intelligently. Nothing can be more marked than the likes and dislikes of plants. Human beings can hardly express the same feelings more decidedly. There is perhaps even a messmateship among plants, which inclines specific species to prefer to grow in company. Hosts of common plants perform actions which, if they were done by human beings, would at once be brought into the category of right and wrong. There is hardly a virtue or a vice which has not its counterpart in the actions of the vegetable kingdom. As regards conduct in this respect, there is small difference between the lower animals and plants. One of the most elementary manifestations of consciousness and conscious action in plant life is what has been called the gravity sense, or the sense by which the plant recognizes the up and down direction of growth. The germinating seed always sends its roots downward, no matter how the seed may be placed in the ground. This cannot be held to result merely from the action of gravitation, for the sprouts move upward and away from the center of gravity, just as truly as the roots move downward and toward it. Experiments have proven that this sense of direction is as much a true sense as that of any of the special senses of the lowly animal life forms. The experiment has been tried of turning around a sprouting seed, the result being that in a day or so the roots will be again found to be turning downward and the spouts turning upwards. A French botanist named Duhamel once placed some beans in a cylinder filled with moist earth. After they had begun to sprout, he turned the cylinder a little to one side. The next day he turned it a little further in the same direction. Each day he would turn it a little more, until finally it had described several full circles. Then he took out the plant, and shaking off the clinging earth, he found that the beans' roots and sprouts had described circles, two perfectly formed spirals being shown, one of the tiny roots and the other of the tiny sprouts. The roots, in their constant endeavor to move downward, had formed one perfect spiral, while the sprouts, in the constant effort to rise upward, had described another perfect spiral. No amount of effort will cause the roots of a plant to grow upward or its sprouts to grow downward. Each root and sprout has its own sense of direction to which it faithfully and invariably responds. In the same way, and from a similar cause, the tendrils of climbing plants will faithfully move toward the nearby support, and if they are untwined, they will return during the next night to the old support if possible. Moving pictures, carefully prepared and taken over a long period, show that the movement of the tendrils to be akin to the movements of the limbs of an animal, the feelers and graspers of the octopus, for example. And I want to interject something here. I was watching a video, and this man had been looking at the growth of a plant on a tree, and for some reason it was one of those kind of plants that kind of just covers a tree, using the tree like for support for itself. But there was one branch that this plant didn't move on to, and he wondered, because why would it not go there? It went everywhere else. And over the period of time that he was watching this tree, one day that branch broke off the branch that had nothing growing on it just broke. And then he thought, maybe that plant knew that this was a weak branch, not to trust to go out on it because it was going to break soon. And he was thinking, well, that could be the only thing, the only reason it wouldn't cover that area is if it had some kind of thought or knowledge of something that was yet to be in that branch. And I thought, yeah, that was a good experiment. That kind of tells you something there. I believe plants have a lot of understanding. And I've heard many people talk about flowers turning around to look at them. And people talk to flowers, and plants and flowers and sprouts and tendrils, they all have a consciousness and they all have an intelligence. I can really agree with this book. Anyway, let me continue on with it. Not only have the roots of plants the general sense of direction, which causes them to grow downward in spite of all attempts to prevent them, but they have also the sense of moisture, which causes them to seek the direction of water. Many plants also turn their leaves and blossoms to the light, no matter how often they are turned to the opposite directions. Potatoes in dark cellars will often send forth their sprouts 20 or 30 feet in the direction of light, which shows through a tiny crack in the wall. Likewise, plants possess the sense of taste to a very high degree in some cases. By means of this sense, they are able to detect differences in substances and to choose those substances which are conducive to their nutrition. They are able to distinguish between poor and rich soil, and also between different chemicals of differing nutritive values. They always move their roots in the direction of the best food supply and also toward moisture. Not only do the roots of plants move in the direction of water, but instances have been cited in which the leaves of plants will bend over during the night and dip themselves in a vessel of water several inches away. Insect-eating plants recognize the difference between living animal substance and bits of inorganic matter or vegetable substance, casting off the latter two as if in disgust. Experiments have been made of placing a bit of cheese in the reach of such plants when, though cheese is of course unfamiliar to them, they will seem to recognize its nitrogenous nature and will devour it as readily as they will a piece of flesh or the body of an insect. Many students are doubtless familiar with the instance of the sensitive plants which exhibit a marked degree of sensibility to touch. Many insect-eating plants manifest an equally high degree of sensitiveness, though of course in a different direction. The leaves of the Venus flytrap fold upon each other and thus capture the unfortunate insect which has been tempted into the trap by the sweet juice which appears upon the leaf as a dainty bait. The folding of the leaves follows the alarm given by the 3 sensitive bristles or hairs which act as feelers which sense the presence of the insects. Bits of earth or raindrops are recognized as not food by these feelers, and no closing of leaves results from their presence on the leaves. Other plants are very sensitive to degrees of light, and they close at certain hours, the time varying according to the species of the plant. It was formerly held that this sensitiveness to light was merely a chemical response to the presence of light, but recent experiments have shown that such plants, when placed in a dark room, will continue this closing for several days in a gradually lessening degree, thus indicating the presence of a habit within their consciousness, which habit indicates the presence of mind even more forcibly than does the closing itself. Certain ferns will wither if their fronds are touched too often. In the case of seeds, the presence of consciousness and mental operation are manifested. Not only in the process of sprouting, but also in other processes, does the seed show signs of life and mind. Certain seeds are carried to their future abode by means of running streams, along which they work their way to congenial soil by means of tiny projecting filaments, which they move as legs and thus propel themselves to shore. A botanist has said regarding a certain species of these swimming seeds, "So curiously lifelike are their movements that it is almost impossible to believe that these tiny objects make good progress through the water, are really seeds and not insects." Certain plants prey upon other plants, twining bands around other plant or tree, which bands work their way through the outer covering of the bark and thus act as suckers through which the parasitic plant draws nourishment from the larger plant, the latter succumbing in time and being literally killed for food by the clinging plant. In South America, there are varieties of these climbers which will mount to the top of a tall tree in this way, and after killing their support, they will wave long tendrils in the breeze until they fasten hold of another tree, which in turn is depleted of its vitality and nourishment, and so on until the parasite is surrounded by a large circle of ruined victims. Other parasites content themselves with boring into a tree trunk, and then absorbing enough of the sap of the latter to enable them to live without other work on their own part. In some species, the habit of parasitism is known to have been acquired during the history of the plant, just as some animals and human beings have acquired similar habits.